studios of Penn State Public Broadcasting, tonight's program is part of WPSU's Common Ground Lobby Talk series.
More than 15 years ago, advocates for girls made the case that girls were not receiving the same quality of education as boys. More recently, advocates for boys have made the argument that now boys are the ones falling behind. A recent report by AAUW titled "Where the Girls Are: The Facts About Gender Equity in Education" examines these issues more closely in our schools today. How far have girls come? Is there really a crisis for male students? And how do gender, race, economic, and social backgrounds affect scholastic achievement? Hi, I'm Dr. Cheryl De La Sega. Welcome to tonight's Common Ground Lobby Talk, Where the Girls Are: Gender Equity in Education. Tonight we'll discuss what factors contribute to girls' success, and we'll look at what we need to do to continue to improve achievements for all students. Let's welcome our guests. Christiane Corbett is a research associate at the AAUW Educational Foundation and co-author of the report that inspired tonight's discussion. Kimberly Griffin is an assistant professor of education policy studies and a research associate for the Center of the Study of Higher Education at Penn State. And Terry Vecchio is an associate professor of psychology at Penn State. Thank you all for joining us. Christiane, I'm going to start with you. Tell us about this report, how you went about accomplishing the data, and what's the most compelling findings that you discovered?
Sure. AAUW decided to look at this, at the issue of boys and girls, how they're actually doing, because there's been so much attention recently paid to boys, that there's a boys' crisis in education. And so as an organization focused on women in education, we thought, let's take a look at the data. And so we looked at a number of factors, standardized test scores, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the SAT, the ACT, high school graduation rates, college graduation rates. We looked at all of those, and on average, we saw that in every case, boys and girls' achievement has actually been improving over the past decades. And so that's on average. However, we did see significant gaps, but they were not so much by gender as they were by race, ethnicity, and income level. So those were the main findings, was that there really is no boys' crisis in education. If there is a crisis at all, it's really for lower income students, African American students, and Hispanic students, girls and boys.
Okay. Well, I'm going to throw this out. Is there any reason why we should think about educating girls and boys differently from a physiologic standpoint, from a developmental standpoint, based on what you know?
Well, there is scholarship that shows that while boys being educated separately, it isn't that big of a difference. Some of the boys that are performing at lower levels do better when they're in all boys classrooms. Actually, girls do a lot better when they're in all girls classrooms and in all girls schools or attending women's colleges. And this is for women of all different levels of academic ability. And some of it seems to be linked to the fact that in environments where women are encouraged to take leadership roles, there aren't boys to take leadership roles. So women are the stars of the athletic teams, they're the leaders of all the clubs, they're the smartest kids in class, they really have voice and feel like they can share their ideas in a really free space. These institutions are built around the idea that they really are there to encourage the achievement of girls and that their voices are valuable. They have lots of mentors and role models. So it does seem that there are some positive outcomes that come from single-sex environments, particularly for girls.
Well, that kind of addresses the interesting issue of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which suggests that if we give girls the message that maybe boys are a little bit better in science, a little bit better in math, they act in ways that live out that prophecy. Terry, would you have any comments on whether that's relevant here?
Yeah, I think it's extremely relevant. When we talk about self-fulfilling prophecy, typically people behave in subtle and nuanced ways that convey that we expect stereotypic things. It's not like people say girls are less good and girls just then crash and burn. It's much more subtle than that. It's in terms of who's called on in classes, who gets attention, who gets rewarded, who gets the valued resources, and who gets opportunities to be leaders. Gender roles, stereotypes of women, stereotypes of girls, and stereotypes of a good leader are directly in conflict. And when there are men who fit into those roles and there's not the conflict, the roles often go to women. That's true among children and it's true in businesses. And the more masculine the field, the more stereotypically masculine the field or the class, the more that's true. So what's important about the self-fulfilling prophecy effects, though, is that it really is the behaviors of whites, of men, that are subtle and nuanced, that elicit evidence of stereotype confirmation from other people. So the degree to which we ask questions, engage people, give people opportunities to excel and demonstrate competence. And then you get evidence of stereotype confirmation. It's much more nuanced than just putting expectations out there and women and people of color doing poorly in the face of those expectations.
Well, Christy, I want to go back to your opening comments about the crisis in boys' education. You know, New York Times headline, books, all kinds of media suggesting that somehow helping girls has been bad for boys.
Right.
Can you address that? Like, is it difficult for people to see girls get special attention, or what's going on here?
I think that's part of it. I think there is some discomfort in our culture with girls doing better than boys in some areas, and girls do. The main point that people who claim that there's a boys' crisis, the main point that they talk about is that women now earn the clear majority of undergraduate degrees in college. Women may earn 57% in 2006 of the undergraduate degrees awarded. What is important to realize, though, is that because so many more people are getting college degrees, more men than ever are also getting degrees. So it's not like there's a pie and women are getting a bigger portion of the pie. The pie's gotten bigger. And so men, too, are earning more degrees than ever before. But women are earning these degrees at a faster rate. And that's something that's not unique to the United States. It's an international phenomenon. Most industrialized countries see that. So there are different reasons for why more women go to school. There's some evidence that shows that the benefits of a college degree are greater for women than for men. And another thing that's important to realize is that most women are much more likely to go back to school when they're older. So if you look at kids coming out of high school, seniors graduating from high school, there's almost no gender difference. It was 66% of girls went straight from high school into college in 2006, and 65.5% of boys did so. So there's not so much of a gender gap there. It's when you look at folks in their 20s, women are more likely to go back to school at that age. So.
Okay, and for anyone, our own Penn State Women's Commission for Women, recently released a study that showed here at Penn State, we actually have a higher percentage of women in faculty and staff now. And yet we still have fewer women students in the sciences. For example, in engineering, only 16% of students are female. Comments?
We keep looking at each other like, it's really interesting when we look at the sciences and break it down by particular subfields. So traditionally, it's been argued that women don't tend to perform as well in the sciences, that they're not as represented in the sciences. But now that when we look at different fields and, colloquially referred to as the hard sciences versus the soft sciences. So sciences such as biology, psychology, you see that women are actually gaining a lot of parity. We almost see 50% of degrees, undergraduate degrees, graduate degrees, going to women in these fields, although we still see vast disparities when we look at the faculty ranks and who's actually entering roles as assistant professors, becoming associate professors, becoming full professors. But when we look at the sciences like physics, engineering, computer sciences, we still see that women are widely underrepresented in terms of those classrooms, definitely underrepresented in graduate schools, and very, very small numbers in terms of faculty.
Well, I'm going to ask Terry to comment on the fact that I'm in the College of Medicine, and over the last few years we've seen the percent of women steadily increasing until now more than half of our enrolling class is female. And you mentioned before returning students. I'm wondering, is there something about women that change as they mature and they pursue a medical career? Or is it, as Kimberly was saying, that's more in the soft sciences? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I think there's research research showing that the degree to which people fit into a domain, feel socially connected, and feel that they can succeed is a great predictor of where people go. And so when you look at computer sciences, some of the physical sciences, and you try to ask people that are underrepresented to imagine themselves in those fields, right away there's questions about the degree to which you belong and can succeed. Whether those are questions about the degree to which you should experience stereotypes and prejudice, or just the degree to which people like you do well. And that's a big predictor of how well people do. And in fact, there's intervention research by Waltner and Cohen showing that if you can come in and show women and people of color that their anxieties and their concerns about not belonging in these domains are concerns common among all first-year undergraduates, that you increase representation in the number of people in those classes. When it's not special about being a minority. So I think there's stuff like that going on where we have fields where the things that are valued and predictive of success are stereotypically masculine domains. So people can expect to experience stereotypes and discrimination. You walk into these domains, stereotypes are salient. Women, African Americans, Latinas are riddled with concerns about, from other people's behaviors, whether or not you're going to confirm negative stereotypes. And then you have situations where you're talking about increase in women coming back. I don't know the reason why there'd be a bigger gender inequity later, but I would guess when you get into the real world, women and African Americans and Latinos can't do as well without a college education, and you experience the hardships of living with discrimination and low income, and so you're more motivated to go back.
Well, and certainly we know that women on average make less money than men. So it's 78 cents to the dollar in 2007. And so that is one reason. A college degree increases a woman's earnings, as it does for men.
Well, I wanted to ask you now, you have a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering. What influenced you to go into a career or get a degree that may have been traditionally thought of as sort of a more male kind of education?
Well, for me, I always enjoyed math, and I was good at math, and that's true for many women, actually, who go into engineering, that they tend to be strong in math. And so I did that, and I worked for 8 years as a mechanical engineer in the aerospace industry, and it was a very good experience. Those are good jobs, but it didn't feel like a good fit for me, and I'm not unique in that. This happens to a lot of women. Nonetheless, I think that these are good fields for women, and so that's why I decided to try to work in that area to try to make these fields more welcoming for women.
I'm going to push you a little bit on that. So what happened back in middle school? Because we know girls tend to do pretty well in math and science, and then they hit those middle school years and suddenly either it's not popular to be smart in math or be a science geek or whatever. And those are really formative years. What happened to you? Did you have a role model, or what did you see that really helped you persevere to even apply for a degree like that?
Well, in fact, I did run into a number of obstacles, and I actually tried not to do it. I remember my senior year in high school. I said, I'm not going to take calculus. I want to do comparative, it was world culture or something like that. So I did that, and after a couple weeks, I thought, wait a second, I miss it. I actually missed math. I mean, I really enjoyed it. So but I don't know. I think that there are a lot of people like that actually out there. So, and then when I went to college, I did not major in engineering for the first couple of years. Then by my third year, I said, wait a second, I'm not using this part of my brain, and I'd really like to. So I added in engineering as a degree, as a major. So, people come into it in different ways, I think. But it is a struggle, I think, for women and for underrepresented minorities often to persist in these fields because there just aren't a lot of role models there, and they tend to be very masculine environments, the work world specifically.
And we know that girls during those formative years go through this thing where self-esteem is all tied into school performance. And in fact, 78% of girls with low self-esteem find it hard to feel good at school. And more surprising, 54% of girls with high self-esteem still find it hard to feel good at school. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think the middle school years are where people get inundated with the sexualized images of girls, and everything's about how you look as opposed to what you can do. And that's when gender concerns in terms of dating come up. That's where media exposure, you're inundated with images of women that are nothing more than objects. And I think that those are bad things for women, to be focused on how you look and take a third person perspective on yourself, as opposed to being focused on how you feel about what you're capable of doing or what you can do, is just not a good thing. And I think that those self-esteem effects show that, and that we do something very different to our daughters that we do to our sons.
Well, I wanted to talk about, just throw this out, if you remember back in 1993, we started the Take Our Daughters to Work Day. Now, from the Ms. Foundation, there was a movement that we would take them with us so they could see their strong mothers at work. And about 10 years later, under a little bit of pressure, we started taking our sons to work, too. What do you think? Has that been a good thing? Should we take our sons and our daughters to work, or should we go back to just taking the girls?
I think it's good to take both, girls and boys, just because I think it's important. It's difficult when you're young to know kind of what your options are. What is the world of work like? It's difficult to make choices like that. So I think it's important to bring the boys along with the girls.
Yeah, about the other two.
I think anytime you get a chance to see somebody actually modeling the career that you want to have, or being exposed to new ideas about what you can do. I know growing up we thought that you could be a doctor, a lawyer, or a business person, and that was it. There's no other careers in the world. So going to work with your parent and seeing the things they do, I think is always a powerful experience, and opens up your mind to all the different things you can do as a child. So bring the daughters and the sons, that's fine.
I think one of the biggest effects of class is that, of being lower income, is that it's hard to see what your array of options are. And so among maybe more privileged groups, we think be doctor, lawyer, but among more working class people or lower income people, that you don't even see those options. So I think the more that you can bring people to work and show them the array of options. So you don't have to be a lawyer or a doctor, you can be all these other things, but more importantly, to show a pattern of options to people who don't have models in their family. Because class, so much of it is about even realizing the options are there in the first place. So I would say sons and daughters, and that we should, work hard to make it something that exposes the kids brought to school to the biggest array of possibilities.
I'm going to follow up on that because I want to go back to the report, the AAUW report. Basically, what's good for girls is good for boys, but not all girls and all boys. You found some very interesting things about different subgroups. Would you want to address that briefly?
Right, well, yeah, and I think what Terry's saying about income is right on, that income predicts performance. And so it's very, certainly lower income students are not getting the same opportunities as higher income students. And so what we found when we looked at pretty much it was every indicator. It was the SAT, the ACT, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Lower income students' scores were always lower than their higher income peers in every case. And so while there were still some gender differences there, income was always much greater than the gender disparities. So that's why we really wanted to make that point that this is really what we should be focusing on. Not that gender is not important; it is very important. And but in terms of what are the biggest issues, they really tend to be income, race, and ethnicity.
Now you mentioned about the wage gap, that women earn 77 cents on the dollar compared to men's wages still, despite all of these achievements. What's it going to take, and I'll throw this out to anyone, what's it going to take, maybe you're our power expert, and since money is sometimes power, what do you think it's going to take to end that kind of discrepancy? And how does that all get tied in with education? Will improving education in science and technology and engineering for girls get that difference up? Or down? I guess we want to reduce it.
Okay, no, what an easy question. I'm just processing the whole question. I think there are a couple things that work in our advantage when we try to deal with racial and gender disparities of whatever sort. To the degree that there's some component of them that are caused by discrimination, I think that we have some power to move and intervene, because the one thing that's good about dominant group members, there's many good things, but the one thing that's good is most people fancy themselves egalitarian, legitimate, principled people. And if we know that at the heart, we know that whites generally detest the idea of being thought of as racist. We know that men detest the idea, most men detest the idea of being thought of as sexist. We also know that if you ask any African American, any Latino to show me the one white person that's never done anything racist, they'd kind of chuckle. And we all know that if you ask women, show me the one man that's never done anything sexist, we'd probably all chuckle. But the good part about that is, given that people really fancy themselves to be principled people, that there's a disconnect between what it means to act in a racist or sexist way, and that's education. We think of a racist or sexist person as that passionate in the heart, somebody who thinks women are incompetent. That's not what causes the problem. That may cause some problems, but that may not be what's the primary problem. The primary problem may be something much more basic, like how we think men and women are complementary opposites that come together to make a whole unit, and how women have skills that don't have attributes that we value, but not in the workplace. Like, there's a whole host of things, and what's important is that the behaviors that cause the self-fulfilling prophecy effects are probably very subtle and nuanced. If we assume that people are good, principled people, then they wouldn't do things that they can readily detect as racist or sexist. And what we find in our lab, and with my students who are here, what we find over and over again is that sexism, racism is always subtle. It's always sugar-coated in some way, such that when I act racist, I can't see it, because how could I possibly be racist just because I'm giving you none of the value tasks? I'm telling you how wonderful you are over and over again. How could I possibly be racist if I'm praising you excessively? And so there's this piece where we can educate people. We can get people to understand that racism and sexism are subtle and nuanced things. And to the degree that you can do that, you can actually reduce prejudice. In the prejudice reduction research, we do perspective-taking manipulations, work very well. When people listen to an African-American male who's an undergraduate talk about what it's like to be an African-American male at Penn State and how difficult it is, they learn a whole bunch of stuff. They're thinking of racism as people shouting down the street, and that's not what's being described. And then we see dramatic drops in prejudice. So if you can put together that you want to be a good person, but that means kind of detecting both the things that you may do that are trivial niceties and the things that you do that reflect that maybe you don't think people are so competent or you're equal. I think that there's great room for change in that regard. And my research shows that it's the subtle and nuanced things that powerful people do that cause some small slice of that gender difference in performance on standardized tests. Now that's 6%, an effect size of 6% of the variance on standardized test scores, but that's in a lab with 2 times, treating women in a demeaning way twice, and it accounts for 6%. If you think about that over time, we have a fair amount of room to improve and engage. I think the default assumption is that we need to get people on the same page. People want to be good and egalitarian people for the most part. People who don't want to be, we're not going to change anyway. And if we can help people understand how those behaviors mismatch, and that, get people away from the defensiveness, often there's not good discussions between, I've seen very few discussions between somebody who's white and Latino, white and African American, about what it means to be racist, and without white people being very defensive. And the same thing has to happen with gender in order for it to happen, but I think that there's lots of interventions that can happen.
What about the people doing the educating, the teachers? We know that teachers tend to pay a little bit more attention to boys because they tend to pay a little more attention to the disruptive factor in classrooms. And unfortunately, studies show that it's usually the boys who are, a little more physical and moving around and attracting attention. How do we get teachers to, focus on all groups and then factor in this whole other, the low income, the ethnicity? How do we help the teachers?
Yeah, like Terry was saying, I don't think that people come into classrooms as bad people thinking, I'm going to pay more attention to the boys today, or I'm going to ignore the students of color over here today. These are things that are very subtle, they're very unconscious. They're just things that we do and that we can't even necessarily see in ourselves. So while teacher training around, being attentive to all students and their needs and what are the best ways to develop each student in the classroom is really important, some of the interventions that have been found to be particularly powerful are ones where master teachers or teacher educators actually come into the classroom and observe what the teacher is doing and, videotape even, and then are able to sit down and talk with that teacher about, okay, when you interacted with this student in this way, students respond based on your expectations. They respond to the way that you treat them. So how are your expectations of this student, which you may not even be aware of, resulting in the behavior that you see coming back from this student, and really helping teachers deconstruct that and continue their professional development after they've actually left the classroom.
And it's important to show people the specifics, because when you have white and black people, for example, interact, one of my colleagues, Jack DeVideo, some of his research shows that the predictor of what I think as a white person, how comfortable and how fun this interaction was, is my explicit attitudes, the degree to which I say I like African Americans, or the degree to which I explicitly report prejudice. But African Americans on the other side of the table, what predicts their experience of the same interaction is my implicit biases, the stuff I'm unaware of. And part of the reason is because the implicit stuff drives behaviors we don't readily control. The nonverbals, the making less eye contact, turning away, speech errors. So much of racism and sexism is about this subtle stuff, so we really have to take this kind of approach of showing people exactly what behaviors differ. Discrimination isn't about intent. Intent doesn't matter. If you're looking at a girl less in the classroom, making less eye contact, encouraging her less, regardless of your intent, this is how it's manifest. And it's hard for people to see that and just kind of catch themselves when they don't know how subtle and nuanced it is.
I think we have a question from the audience, so let's let you jump in here.
Hi, I'm Joanne Tosti-Vasing, president of Pennsylvania now. In 1972, Title IX was passed 36 years ago that basically said that we had to be more equitable in both education and athletics. As part of that bill, there was a mandate to collect data at the college level to look at both education and athletics to make sure that we were providing an equitable education. When I went through high school, girls were tracked into home economics and boys were tracked into shop. That data was not mandated under Title IX for high school and elementary schools. A year and a half ago, Senator Connie Williams introduced a bill here in Pennsylvania that would mandate that kind of data collection. The data are there, it's just not being put together in the way that the AAUW put it together for this report that you just did. What is your thoughts on having that kind of policy at the public school level?
So having the collection of data and having
it aggregated and deaggregated so that we can find out which school districts are having problems so we can make recommendations to improve education. Because if we look across the state, we have some schools that are very, very good. A lot of it has to do with the what you were talking about with the taxes and the higher income. Some of it has to do with just the way that they're providing the educational programs.
I think disaggregated data is always helpful. It's always helpful to be able to pinpoint where the problems are, to be able to even drill down into what schools are doing a better job than other schools, or which classrooms within schools are actually doing a good job. I think we do a lot of identifying what the problems are, but not a lot of identifying what the best practices are and who are doing things that actually are working. So to the extent that we can have disaggregated data that really actually helps us pinpoint those things, it's only going to be helpful.
I have to say, I remember Title IX quite fondly because I was a junior in high school and I was one of 2 girls that swam on the boys' swim team that year. It was the best year of my life, and the sense of power and mastery that I had. You talk about power, that was great. Following up on the idea of tracking and looking at data, AAUW came out with an earlier report. Did you follow up to see if things on a very concrete level changed in the classroom?
Well, that's How Schools Shortchange Girls is the report that you're talking about, which was published in 1992. And that report found that girls, like we've talked about a little bit already here, that girls get less attention from teachers in the classroom. They are called on less frequently. When they're asked questions, the questions are requesting short answers, not well thought out answers. The teachers will sometimes wait not as long for a girl to answer as they would for a boy, things like that. And so these were, it was very qualitative type of research. And this report that we've just put out, Where the Girls Are, was more quantitative. really looking at test scores. So we didn't follow up, but anecdotally we know that how schools shortchange girls made a difference because that's what people know about AAUW basically. When you tell them you're from AAUW, they often say, oh, you did the How Schools Shortchange Girls report, and it still comes up. I mean, it comes up a lot. And so I think that just the awareness that it brought to the issue probably made a difference, but in terms of actual proof that it made a difference, we didn't do a follow-up study.
But it definitely made a huge impact. Remember
yes.
when it came out? And
It
yeah.
did, yes.
So how about parents? We haven't talked really about parents in all of this. What role do parents play in shaping, their daughters and their sons in terms of educational achievement, educational expectations, all kinds of outcomes? Any idea how they factor in?
Well, I do know that there's research that shows that parents are more apt to attribute skill in their sons to the fact that they're good at it, that they're smart, and to their daughters that they work hard, that kind of thing. So, so that's that can be problematic. And parents own perceptions, own gender stereotypes influence their children a great deal.
And yet there are very concrete differences. Even at birth, studies of infants in the nursery show that boys tend to go for the mechanical mobiles and girls tend to go for the faces, the connections. So could it be that parents, and especially intriguing is the kinds of differences you found between math and the sort of reading, English sorts of things, is there possibly something real and biological, or is it social and sort of, what we expect based on what we've been taught?
Well, that's the $64 million question. that's what everybody wants to know. It's certainly a combination of the two, but the biology part is. If research shows very few differences really between girls and boys, especially the infant studies. Really, there are some studies that show what you're talking about, but the vast majority show that there really aren't differences in that, the ones where girls prefer faces, boys prefer mechanical objects. Most of the research doesn't actually show that. The main biological difference that research has shown to be true is spatial sort of rotation, that boys actually do seem to be more proficient at visualizing things, objects rotated, and girls are not as good at that, although it's something that can be learned. And research also shows that if you can teach girls to do it in a relatively short time, and then they improve. So we can all learn, basically. So most of these differences are cultural, but there are certainly biology plays a role.
And I would wonder the degree to which a biological explanation can be made when math differences in your report don't pop up until 13 and 17. At 9, there aren't any. At the age of 9, there's no differences in math performance among children. And then at 13, we see some emerge, and by 17, they're consistent, right?
That's right. I mean, right. The gender differences are so small that it's hard. And also, if you look cross-culturally, it's not true in every country that girls' math scores are lower than boys. And if you look at some of the Asian countries like Singapore and Taiwan, girls from Singapore and Taiwan, their math scores are way higher than American boys' math scores. So certainly it's not a genetic thing. All the evidence seems to be pointing to culture over biology.
And quick note about parents and influence on grades and degree aspirations and all those other good things, particularly around some of the racial and ethnic disparities that you notice in class disparities. That when we look at the aspirations of parents for their children, all parents want wonderful things for their children. They all express that they want them to go to college. They want them to reach the highest levels possible in their education and their careers, but parents that have more formal education in their backgrounds are able to help their students reach those goals in ways that parents who don't are not. So you see these parents that have experienced more formal education, gone to college, are able to specifically help their students with their homework in ways that the parents who haven't aren't, or able to instruct them about the schools that would be appropriate for them, make sure that they get tutoring when they're experiencing a little bit of challenge in their classes, and are just more attentive and aware to some of the things that parents who want those same things for their children don't really know or aren't really able to help their children in the same way. So say, you know, work hard and do your best, and yes, we want you to go to college, but aren't necessarily able in the same ways to help their students walk that path.
There's also variability in the degree to which parents socialize their children in terms of race socialization and gender socialization, with a specific focus on helping children learn how to cope with discrimination. So there's huge variability. Some families have conversations about the race discrimination their children should expect to face, other families don't, and then there's questions about how much that happens with your daughters. But those kinds of conversations, in a sense, are helpful too, beyond just the basics of being able to help someone with their education, because it helps you figure out where to place when you're faced with these situations where there's a question about social fit, or there's anxiety about whether or not you can do it. At least the attributions don't become internal. It's something about me. There's attributions elsewhere that can keep persistence up.
Yeah, and it's been shown to buffer some of those effects around stereotype threat too, and self-fulfilling prophecies. If you know that, okay, I'm feeling a little bit stressed out right now because people are going to think I'm not going to do so well on this math test, or people think that I'm not as smart as my classmates, you can at least, you know, relax a little bit and think about, okay, but that's not about me, that's about somebody else, and kind of reattend yourself to your work.
Groups that are highly racially identified have this buffer against stereotype threat effect, and I think it's reasonable to expect that in some of those groups there might be quite a lot of race socialization and helping children get ready to give them coping skills to learn how to cope with these things they're inevitably going to face. I don't know the degree to which it happens with gender. You know, I don't know.
Well, looking at coping skills and teaching children coping skills, we know that adolescents now, in particular, tend to not have as much connection and meaningful contact and consistent contact with adults as in the past. I mean, that's dropping and dropping and dropping as there are more parents in the workplace, working long hours. How do we, less public spaces where they're interacting, maybe less community, families are extended and living in all different areas of the country. How do we help foster these connections, these healthy connections that teach children, low-income children, you know, children at risk, these kinds of meaningful coping skills and ways to forge ahead positively?
Don't know.
Okay, all right.
I'm a big advocate for mentoring and people in the community really taking time to reach out to students who may not have the opportunity to spend time with their parents in the ways that they would like. If a parent is working 2 to 3 jobs, to just make sure that, you know, they're putting food on their table and making sure that their child has clothes to wear so that they can go to school, there's going to be less time to talk about, you know, how to do well in school or how to realize some of your goals, or yes, these are things you're going to experience as a student, and here are the tools you can arm yourself with. Here's the armor that you can put on to know that it's not about you, it's about them, and you really are capable of doing anything that you want to do. So having mentors and role models not only can help with putting some of that armor on, but also can help a little bit with, you know, some of the things we discussed earlier, turning those aspirations into concrete steps to reach your goals. If you say, hey, I want to be an engineer when I grow up, you know, what more powerful experience is there to work with an engineer or to know an engineer and hang out with an engineer on the weekends and find out that, yeah, you know, I took a lot of math classes in high school, and, you know, these are the types of colleges I was thinking about, and these are the things that I did to prepare myself to enter that type of career. So I think mentoring is really important and really key.
Yeah, and studies have certainly shown the benefits of mentoring, but on a very pragmatic level, who makes that happen? I mean, do parents go out and say, hey, I need a mentor for my child, or is it the school? How do you see that playing out in real life?
Sure. I think there are lots of programs and initiatives set up through schools, outside of schools, community organizations. You know, we all know Big Brothers and Big Sisters, but, you know, people have avenues through their churches, through any organization that they're a member of, to find adults who might have some free time to work with their child. Extended family networks, you know, with technology being what it is today, you can mentor somebody very far away with a little webcam and, you know, talk to them over email and ask whatever questions that you have. So
Text message mentoring.
Text message mentoring.
But I do think it's important, though, the mentoring, we often think of mentoring in the sciences, computer science, all the domains, the STEM domains in which women and people of color are underrepresented. And I do think it's important to think about who does that mentoring. And because we're doing research right now in our lab looking at power differences and how people who are under threat of belonging uncertainty, when they're worried about not fitting in, how they're more eager to find somebody who will be a mentor, but how that can result in huge violations. So it's interesting, the mentors really need to be somebody who knows the discipline, but also the particular obstacles that people would be facing. So a well-intentioned person who thinks they get it, that who can still do subtly racist and sexist things, could alienate a person more so than not having a mentor in the first place. So I do think it's important that it's both the kind of career and goal focused and the particular challenges that members of different groups, low income, would face.
I think we have a question here to the right.
Hi, you guys had talked a lot about, engineering being a more male-dominated field. Well, I'm a senior graduating in May, and I'm actually a communications major, and I'm lucky if I have 2 boys in my class. So why do you think that females are maybe more attracted to that field? Is it because we're quote unquote more personal with our relationships? Are we like being around people, or why would you think it's sort of the opposite for communications? Is it, because engineering is the farthest thing from my mind right now, but so I just, sort of speak to that, and why do you think that is?
Christy?
Well, there are fields that they're typically female and typically male, and so they're kind of these cultural models, basically, of what girls do and what boys do, and so communications is something that is more affiliated with the female gender in terms of girls are there's a stereotype that girls talk more, that girls are better, relationships are more important to girls than to boys. And there is some truth in that. There's usually a grain of truth in every stereotype, and that's it's true that from a young age, girls do profess to care more about relationships than boys, and so that may be a reason. There are a lot of cultural subtle influences on all of us that it's hard to identify, but the field of communications fits more kind of in the role and the kind of schema, the gender schema of what a girl should be, what a woman is, basically.
So in thinking about Carol Gilligan and her seminal research on relational psychology, you would say that's a bit of stereotype, or her suggestion was that just as you asked, young women tend to be more relational, more interactive, and that's part of our psychology and a very necessary way that we grow and develop. True or not?
Well, it's true that that our culture treats girls and boys differently. And so girls are rewarded for behaving in certain ways. Boys are rewarded for behaving in different ways. So that's part of how we all grow up and kind of how we feel good about who we are in terms of our gender, and how well we fit. I think Terry was talking about fit, sort of like what it matters in terms of career specifically. You look for a career that fits well with what you think of as a woman or a man, what a man or a woman should do.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that?
Gender is socialized really early and thoroughly too. I mean, it's interesting, it's different from other categories. People live with gender in their home, with gendered tasks in the home, gender roles. And gender is different from a lot of stereotypes. Often people think that the ways in which men are stereotyped and women are stereotyped are accurate. You never hear somebody making the argument that stereotypes of African Americans and whites are accurate, but you often hear people talk about how stereotypes of men and women are accurate and how men and women come together as a complementary whole. And so it's socialized so thoroughly that by the age of 3, you see children doing gender categorization. There's one of my all-time favorite studies I remember reading as an undergraduate. I think it was Amy Sheldon, who's a linguist. By the age of 5, she staged fights between children, over a toy. and fighting over the pickle. And when a girl was involved, the gendered speech patterns resolved the conflict quicker and facilitated communication, and you move right beyond it. And the boys would go at it. And so you could, on the one hand, you could say, it's so young, it must be inherent, but I would take it as it's so young and there's not this evidence at birth that it's so young that that's how strongly it's socialized. And that's how strongly we've gendered our professions. This is what's expected, and this is what is good, and this is what's female, and they fit. This is what's expected, this is what's good, this is what's male, and they fit. And the cross is difficult and sometimes punished.
So getting back to your discussion earlier, or your mention earlier of single gender classrooms and how girls tend to do better in those settings, based on what she's just said, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Should we mix so that girls, see more of this and confront it and don't just buy into the fact that there are certain things they can and can't do? Or what are your thoughts on that?
There are pros and cons to single-gendered classrooms. I think the girls who experience these classrooms definitely talk about these enriching experiences that they had. They don't have to deal with conflicts with boys in that environment in that way, but they seem okay with dealing with it later. So, in college classrooms, professors report that right away they can tell the girls who went to all-girl high schools because their hands shoot up right away when they have a question or when they have something to say. They don't feel inhibited. However, they sometimes talk about not knowing how to interact with boys socially as much. And feeling a little bit more uncomfortable in engaging with boys outside of classrooms or just in more casual areas. When I was thinking as you guys were talking about the socialization piece and how some researchers actually have linked the socialization of girls to some of the differences that we see in academic achievement between boys and girls, and that the skills that we value most in classrooms, the ability to sit still and follow directions and pay attention to authority and listen, are skills that are more likely to be socialized amongst girls than there are amongst boys, who are given a little bit more latitude in terms of being rambunctious and things like that. So I think it's interesting how it kind of intersects with some of those career choice things, but also how well they actually do in a classroom and how they perform on grades and tests and things.
So what's ahead for AAUW? Another study, or what's, knowing this, you've done two very interesting reports. Any more planned in the future to look at these issues?
Yes, actually we're getting started on our next report already, which is going to be focused on key research findings in the area of women in science, technology, engineering, and math. So, we're looking at all the latest research, and we'll be profiling some of the more key findings that might be surprise people, that might be of interest to the general public. So
great. Yes. So how do we address the classroom and the home setting? What are, if each of you had to think of some recommendations that we could make for parents, for people in the audience, people listening, what can we do to help children achieve better? We still have a ways to go. There are some things in this report, some things we've talked about here that certainly impact on the lives of, could it be same-sex classrooms? Could it be athletics? Could it be working with teachers on subtle bias? What would be the most important thing that you could identify to help change the status quo that we have now? Now, I guess I'd like each of you to maybe give your thoughts from your different perspectives, since you have a different background.
I can start. I think, throughout this discussion we've talked about men or women or students of color as these homogenous groups, and without acknowledging sometimes the diversity within those groups and some of the different trends that we might see in students where their identities intersect. So as you mentioned earlier, that you're dealing with something different if you're dealing with a low-income Latino student versus a middle-income Latino student versus a high-income Latino student who's a woman. You have all these intersecting identities going on, and really pushing teachers and parents and educators to really try to see their child for their individual needs, thinking about what individual things this particular student might need based on their identity, based on their context, and really trying to meet those needs in the context of knowing that we have all of this research and we have all of this literature that informs our practice and can inform the work we do. We really do need to be attentive to the student who's right in front of us and making sure that we acknowledge what their individual needs are based on where they're at.
So not slotting people into categories or student into categories. Okay. How about you?
Well, I would agree with what Kim said. I think that's right, that you have to keep in mind the individual. Given all that we know generally, you still can't stereotype because people come from different places. And one thing that I think is very interesting that research has shown is that among people who think that you're born with a given amount of intelligence and it's sort of fixed, that those people tend to feel defeated in the face of challenge, whereas those who think I can increase my intelligence, I can learn, I can become, I can become smarter. Those people tend to feel invigorated in the face of challenge. And so if that kind of thing is an important thing that we can impart to our children, is that they can always improve, that even if they're struggling now, they can always get better. That they don't have a given amount of intelligence. So that's what I would suggest.
We have a question, but I think we'll go to Terry briefly. You want to add your
question?
Let's do you first. And then...
I think I'd have different advice for parents versus educators. As a parent, and given my experience, given what I do in my experience as a first-generation college kid, I think as a parent, the best thing you could do for a kid is every night before bed, the alphabet going through A to Z, an array of careers or things that they could do. That would have been helpful to know the array of, as a child, that would have been cool. And I do that with my children. So that's one thing I think you could do in terms of opening up and making sure that you're presenting your kids with interesting options in a fun and interesting way. From the perspective of my scholarship, I think mine would be focused more on dominant group members because I think it's easy to say don't stereotype. I think it's hard to not stereotype. And so I think that there's this interesting thing. I think intersectionality matters, but it matters in this from the perspective of the people who have power over our children, who are training our children, who are educating our children, that the intersectionality results in things that make it hard to predict. So a privileged Latino boy is going to be responded to by a white person very differently than a low-income African-American boy, a low-income African-American girl. So from the perspective of people in positions of power, I would say that it would be helpful if people pay attention to those realms in which they feel that discomfort. And the minute you feel that discomfort, kind of think about why and what is it about, how this might be shifting around the status quo in some way you're not used to, how you might not be used to a Latino kid talking to you this way, or whatever it is, because I think that kind of affective discomfort is a trigger too, where your stereotypes are and where all the non-conscious stuff would come up. And I think it's primarily white people's jobs, men's jobs, to do better on this front. And the one way we can do it is by paying attention to where we're uncomfortable.
Okay, we have a question here.
There are so many differences in the ways young people or adults are acculturated depending on what their race and ethnicity is in terms of their gender expectations. I thought maybe you'd comment on that because I think that contributes to the way we respond, but also it has a lot of implications for schools.
I think you're absolutely right that intersections of race and gender are really interesting in how they manifest themselves in classrooms. You have African American students, but the expectations and the outcomes of African American girls are somewhat different than the expectations and the experiences and the outcomes of African American boys. The images that we see of African American girls versus white girls versus Asian girls versus Latino girls are very different. So being attentive to those things and being thoughtful about those things and the cultural expectations associated with each of those groups is really important. So there's a long literature about Latino girls and how going away to college can be challenging for those girls, and that there are cultural expectations and familial expectations, that they'll stay closer to home. And you see that amongst some Asian American ethnic groups as well. Whereas with African American girls, it might be a little bit different, and their relationships with African American boys around academic achievement and who's achieving better and all kinds of other good things are kind of challenging as well. So it's a really interesting question that you pose.
And to what degree is that constant across income level, or would you say that you see perhaps a child who of any minority status who's from a higher income, that it might be a little different, or is this kind of a constant?
I think you see students of higher income levels gaining access to college and doing better in school consistently across racial and ethnic groups. I think one of the interesting things that we found in a recent report is when we look at African American men and women who are gaining access to college, men tend to be more affluent than the female students are. So suggesting that, you know, it could suggest a lot of things, but also that lower income African American men are being more effectively shut out of higher education than lower income African American women. They're still finding their way onto college campuses, but African American men that are poor are not. And then that poses the question, well, where are they going? They're not going to college, where are they ending up? And a lot of times it's in the prison system and other things. So.
Exactly what I was thinking. We have another question here.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to ask about how much the research focused at all on learning exceptionalities, and if you guys think that in a classroom, how much you had said about like the focus on boys and girls, how much girls with learning exceptionalities might be overlooked, as far as you know, and you had said about boys are born with an ability, girls work hard. You know, are they being just told that they're not working hard enough, or, you know, are they being just overlooked in general, or what are your thoughts?
So is your question that women who don't fit into the stereotype of performing better than the boys, how are they dealt with in the classroom?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that, and how, if they're overlooked at all, just because they're in the classroom, in a classroom with boys that are being focused on more.
Okay, I just have one more question to
Okay.
clarify. When you say exceptional, you mean exceptionally talented?
No, exceptional as in like learning disabilities
Okay,
and learning
okay.
styles like that. I only
Okay.
asked because when I was in elementary school, I've always had trouble with math. And I was just always told, well, you need to work harder. You need to work harder. And the more I get up in my education, I think, you know, I was overlooked somehow, maybe. And so that's where my question sort of comes from.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
I don't know that I can respond directly to your question, but 2 quick points. Boys actually are over-identified for being routed into remedial education and diagnosed as having learning disabilities. So that might speak a little bit to it, that there's so much focus on the boys and how they're performing that we might miss some of the things going on with girls. But also with Asian American students, where there's this stereotype around high achievement, a lot of those students who actually aren't performing as well as their counterparts report the same thing, that their issues are ignored because there's this expectation that it's okay, you'll be fine, just work a little bit harder, you're a part of this group that tends to do well. Some of their issues get ignored, so it would make sense that, you know, if women are being assumed to do better in the classroom, that if they're not doing as well, it's just they're not working hard enough.
We are out of time. I'd like to thank tonight's guests again for being with us. An excellent discussion. Christine Corbett, a research associate at the AAUW Educational Foundation, co-author of the report that brought us all together tonight. Kimberly Griffin, who is an assistant professor of education policy studies here, and Terry Vecchio, an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Penn State. And thank you for tuning in. For all of us here at Penn State Public Broadcasting, I'm Dr. Cheryl De La Sega. Good night.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU. A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.